In E.F. Benson's The Chippendale Mirror, an antique looking-glass becomes the focal point of a chilling supernatural mystery. As night falls, the mirror's surface darkens, offering glimpses of something beyond our world. A cat's eerie fascination with the glass hints at unseen forces at work. When the boundary between past and present blurs, what consequences await those who peer too deeply into the ornate frame? I am Tony Walker, and on this episode of the Classic Ghost Stories podcast, I will be reading E.F. Benson's The Chippendale Mirror.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back.
The Chippendale Mirror by E.F. Benson. No crime, perhaps, of recent years aroused more interest or stimulated to so high a degree the acumen of the amateur detective as that known as the Wimbledon mystery, whereby Mrs. Yates met the death that so long went unavenged. For nearly 6 months, it may be remembered, the police, even with the aid of the suggestions so liberally supplied to them by their unprofessional colleagues, failed to lay hands on the murderer, who certainly exhibited the most consummate control of himself, and did not, as is generally the case, commit any of those acts of carelessness born of regained confidence, whereby crime is commonly brought home to the criminal. Whether he would have escaped altogether, indeed, is doubtful, for though he had not, when the guilt was fastened upon him, incurred danger by reaping the fruits of his crime, he had not made up his mind to part with the evidence of it. His detection, however, was due to no blunder of his own, but to circumstances against which he could not possibly have guarded himself. It will be well to recall in outline the main facts of his crime. Mrs. Yates had lived for a number of years with her husband in one of the pleasant detached residences that face Wimbledon Common. The marriage, chiefly owing to her intemperate habits, had long been an unhappy one, and a week or so before her death, husband and wife had determined to live apart. She was Italian by birth, and proposed to go back again to her southern skies, and, with the very handsome allowance that he was prepared to give her, to make her home there. The day before she left, he had supplied her with money to the extent of £150 as travelling expenses for herself and her maid, and to enable her to have control of ready cash until she had established her banking account in Rome. This sum was now in her possession, chiefly in the form of £5 notes with a certain amount of English gold. That afternoon her husband was summoned to London on some urgent business affairs, and in the evening telephoned to her that since he would be detained over them till after midnight, he would sleep in town, and meet her next morning at Victoria Station. She would drive up there in the motor car which had taken him to town that afternoon, and would now return without him. Next morning, at 7 o'clock, her maid went into her room to call her, and found her lying on the floor by the bed, with her throat cut. Her head was smothered in one of her pillows, which was tied round it, and the bed and the floor and the furniture of the room were thickly dabbed with her blood. The murderer, it seemed, had worn gloves, for no fingerprints were found, and indeed the charred remains of a pair belonging to her husband were discovered among the ashes in the grate. The fact that they were burnt seemed to indicate that the crime had taken place early in the night, for otherwise the fire in her room would have gone out. The motive for it was clear enough, for her money was missing. Servants sleeping in the house had not heard anything. For nearly 6 months no clues of any kind were obtained. It was ascertained beyond doubt that her husband was not implicated, for he was occupied at his office till after midnight, and shortly before 1 o'clock the night porter of the hotel where he stayed let him in, and took him up in the lift to his room, while for the rest of the night no one entered or left the hotel. The strictest interrogatories were held of the servants in the house, and search made for the missing money, but no light of any sort was cast on this black and baffling crime. It seems certain, however, that the murder was committed by someone who had entered the house for that purpose, for the flower beds below the drawing-room windows, which were open, were marked with footprints, which appeared to have been erased by the murderer, for they were blurred and without value as a clue. Among the banknotes there were certain new ones, of which the numbers were known, but no attempt was made to cash these. The 4 men-servants, butler, chauffeur, and 2 footmen, were narrowly watched, but none showed signs of being in unexplained affluence. The murderer had gone out again into the night as silent and as unobserved as he had entered. Mr. Yates, finally, never lived in the house again. The lease was put up for auction, and a certain part of the furniture, that of his wife's bedroom, was sold, for he could not bear to look on the things that had beheld so grim a tragedy. It was some 5 months after these events that I went in, on my way back from dinner, to see my friend Hugh Granger, who had not long ago settled in town. A sudden inheritance had come to him, and he had lashed out into a new and wonderful motor, a gem of a chauffeur, a fur coat, and a house in Bedford Square, at present rather sparsely furnished, for he had moved into it from narrower quarters. With a wisdom that refused to be hurried, he did not instantly fill up his ungarnished spaces with random purchases, but by dint of keeping his eyes and pockets well open, was gradually acquiring pieces that admirably suited the tall Adam-decorated rooms, and now a sideboard, and now a root chair, and now a Sheraton cabinet would contribute to the embellishment. Tonight I found him in a state of high content over a Chippendale Mirror, which he had found in some incredible place in Putney, and had purchased for an incredibly low price. It had only just arrived, and at present stood on the floor of a sitting-room, till fixed in the divinely appointed place over the chimney-place. Certainly it was a charming acquisition, and gloatingly he pointed out to me the fineness of its inlay, the graceful curves of its framework, its original gilding, and in particular its original glass. "And the price, too," he said. "Why, a modern copy would cost more. Putney! I didn't know such a good thing could come out of Putney." A faint but imperious mewing was heard at the door, and Hugh hastened to obey the orders of Cyrus the Great, his Persian cat, who came very slowly into the room in order to give the maximum amount of trouble to the person holding the door open for his impressive entry. He took no notice, of course, either of the man ironically known as his master or myself, and was just preparing to spring on his usual chair when he turned quickly and ran, tail erect, towards the mirror. Something about it pleased him enormously. The mirror might have been cold grouse, and with loud purrings he proceeded to patrol in front of it, rubbing himself against it. He trod high and delicately, protruding and sheathing his claws at each step, with flashing eyes and switching tail. He went round behind it, positively roaring in his throat with satisfaction, and finally sat down close in front of it, his nose almost touching the glass and looking rapturously into it. But he was not, as you may sometimes see a cat do, regarding his own reflected image. His eyes travelled over the whole surface of it, with quick turnings of his head. "Cyrus is as pleased as you," I remarked. Hugh did not answer. He was watching the cat curiously. If there is one subject that interests him more than beautiful things, it is queer things, things connected with the invisible, psychical world, which exists round us as surely as the material world, and of which we occasionally catch glimpses. Together we have had numerous strange experiences in seances and haunted houses, and it just occurred to me to wonder whether Cyrus's behaviour was being of psychical interest to him. For myself, as far as I am aware, at that moment this rapturous preoccupation of the cat with the mirror gave me no further sentiment than interest in the mysterious perceptions of animals. "I would give the mirror itself to know what Cyrus sees in it," said Hugh at length. "I know—" He stopped suddenly and pointed at the reflecting surface. "What is that?" he said. There's something happening in the mirror. At that moment, it may have been merely the suggestion on his part, I felt that sensation which is so well known to those who've experienced psychical phenomena. It is exactly as if some summons had come to you, not from outside at all, but from inside the brain, which commands your attention. Simultaneously with that mysterious signal, I felt a sudden movement of air stir in the room, a faint but quite perceptible cold current. At the same moment Cyrus, who had been sitting quite still, got up in a sort of ecstasy of content, and looking fixedly into the mirror, clawed at the carpet. I followed Hugh's pointing finger and looked too. The surface of the glass, in spite of the bright light in which it stood, had grown dark, so that I no longer saw the reflection of the cat, of Hugh standing behind him, of the candles that burnt on the table near it. It was dim and dusk in the mirror, and in the dimness something, I couldn't see what, moved across it. Immediately afterwards I saw the normal reflections resume themselves, and Cyrus, suddenly losing interest in it, turned away and marched across the carpet to his usual chair. Hugh spoke. "It's gone," he said. "But I thought... no. Tell me if you thought anything." I own to having been considerably startled. This sudden vanishing of the reflection, above all the sense that there had been something below that darkness, was particularly uncomfortable. "It went dark," I said, "and something moved in the darkness." He laughed. "It's a cheaper bargain than I imagined," he said. "I saw exactly the same thing. I suppose the Psychical Society would call it a case of collective hallucination. But that doesn't seem to explain much." "Let's call it the haunted mirror then," I said, "though perhaps that explains even less." "But one knows what it means," said he. It was some 2 days afterwards that I was in the house again. In the interval the mirror had been put in its appointed place, and looked admirable there, but it had not shown any further signs of behaving in the way mirrors are not expected to behave, and losing its reflecting powers. Here now it was more on a level with my eyes. I could examine it easily and admire the excellence of the work. The glass, as I have said, was original, and, as is usually the case with such things, there were a quantity of dark spots on it, where the glaze of mercury behind it had crumbled and fallen off. But in this more detailed examination I saw that certain of these spots were not under the glass, but on it. There were not more than some half-dozen of them, but at the lower edge of the glass, where it was set into its wooden frame, there was in the crack a little brown deposit, similar to the minute specks on the glass itself, as if some liquid had run into it and dried there rustily, forming just such a stain as you will get below a nail driven into the wall of a fruit garden. But I noticed this so incuriously that when Hugh joined me, I didn't even speak of it. He was inclined to be querulous about the normal behaviour of the mirror. "I looked at it half the morning," he said, "and could see nothing but my own face, and I held Cyrus up to it, to his great disgust. He didn't take the smallest interest in it, and merely wriggled. But did you ever see a mirror so clearly made for that particular place?" "But no more hallucinations?" I asked. "Not one, not the ghost of one, I may say. All the same, Cyrus saw something the other night, and he enjoyed it immensely. Cats have tremendous perceptions, I believe, and they love horrors. They love the dead, you know. By the way, I want you to dine here tomorrow night. 2 marvellously tiresome cousins have asked themselves, and as I always help you out on similar occasions, I expect reciprocal advantages. Free trade, isn't it?" The marvellously tiresome cousins lived up to their character, and we spent a dismal evening. They did not play cards. The lady objected to the smell of cigarettes. They neither of them appeared to possess any ideas on any subject, and, worst of all, they would not go away. Already it was close on midnight. Hugh, with eyes of despair, was talking the most dreary nonsense on the subject of foreign politics, when suddenly there came to my brain that secret signal that I have spoken of, and a little cold draught crept round my head. At that moment Cyrus, who had been sleeping peacefully in his red chair, awoke in a state of purring excitement. He stretched and waved his tail, and then suddenly, catching sight of the mirror, made one superb bound and landed on the chimney-piece. Hugh's voice ceased from its stream of foreign politics, and he took 2 steps across to the fireplace and looked in the mirror. "What a beautiful cat," said the lady, who did not like the smell of tobacco, "and how beautifully it jumps. How lucky there was nothing on the chimney-piece for it to break. Poor pussy." I had stood up too, and her voice came to me as in a dream, for all that was real was comprised in the bright glass, which had again grown suddenly dark. I leant over Hugh's shoulder, hearing his breath coming quick and short as he looked, and in the darkness that hung on the wall of the bright room, I saw certain things. I was looking into a dark room that was lit only by a faint gleam that came through a window blind opposite, and by a lantern that was being carried across that room. A bed glimmered whitely there, and in the bed was a figure that suddenly sat upright as the moving lantern came close to it. The lantern was carried by a man, and for 1 second I caught a glimpse of his face. How long this vision lasted in the actual world of time and space, I cannot say. It seemed to last for just as long as it would take a man to cross a room, and then I became aware that Hugh and I were looking into a perfectly normal mirror, and that Cyrus jumped down on the hearthrug with a soft thud. But in that minute I had descended into some horror of great darkness. I was entangled in a terror that was only bearable because it was mingled with the intensest curiosity. I knew what I had seen. That which had dimmed the polished surface of the glass for those few seconds was something hellish and awful intruding into the quiet boredom of this room in a solid house in a commonplace square. Some silent witness of a tragedy had come to trouble the house. It was not just a photograph of some mysterious fiendish deed that had been presented. It was the very deed itself, and as yet I knew not nor guessed what the deed was. Simply at some time or other a man with a lean, clean-shaven face, which somehow I thought I had seen in actual life, had come with a lantern into a bedroom, but I did not doubt that it was of something terrible that I had had a glimpse. All this flashed through my consciousness as I turned back into the room again. The 2 guests were already on their feet, preparing at last to go. Cyrus was curled up in his chair, and Hugh was saying in a rather odd voice, "What? Already? Surely it's very early." We confabulated together when he returned from his work of speeding the departing, with occasional glances at the mirror, till late into the early hours. We had seen, it appeared, very much the same thing, but whereas I had noticed the face of the man who carried the lantern, he had seen that of the woman who had sat up in bed. To me, that part of the room had been blurred. I had not seen whether it was a man or a woman who lay there. To him also the lantern light had gleamed on something the man carried. It was then that I remembered the brown deposit in the crack between the mirror and its frame. Now, this vision had appeared on 2 occasions about midnight, and our theory, fantastic and terrible, began to take shape. Had some tragedy, such as we had seen the opening of, taken place somewhere, at that hour? Had the mirror retained, as on a photographic plate, some image which was ready, if the conditions for its psychical transmission were favourable, to be reproduced again, made visible to mortal eye? By strange coincidence, the mirror had come into my friend's possession, and he and I, both sensitive to psychical phenomena, had seen a fragment of the deed that had been enacted in front of it. It seemed, too, as if the power that made this visible was on the increase. The message was getting through more clearly. On the first occasion, we had seen little more than darkness. On the second, we had seen something of that which took place below it. We had agreed to meet again the next night, and I arrived at the house about 11, only to find a note from Hugh that he had been unavoidably called away, but expected to be back before midnight. "Look at the woman's face," he had underlined. "An idea has occurred to me." It was with a certain faltering of courage that I settled to go upstairs and wait for him. As I went up, a great flounce of movement from behind the curtain on the stairs startled me, and Cyrus pounced out, preceding me to the room where the mirror hung. He ran in eagerly when I opened the door, and turning on the electric light, I found him erect and superb and pleased in the centre of the carpet. For some while I occupied myself with the evening papers which contained news of merit. Cyrus was coiled up on his chair. The footsteps, which had sounded muffled as they passed up the back staircase, grew quiet, and the hush of night settled down on the house. Outside, where the air was foggy, the square was noiseless, save for the occasional hoot of a motor passing in the streets. By degrees, I found the light growing rather dim, as if the fog had penetrated into the room, and soon it became impossible to read the paper. Yet the air seemed clear enough, and the mirror above the chimney-piece sharply reflected, from where I sat, the ceiling and cornice of the room on which the light from the hearth played and flickered. I had no watch with me, and thus no accurate idea of the speed with which time passed, but I was conscious of an increasing anxiety that Hugh should return. Then, quite suddenly, Cyrus awoke, and stood up on his chair, with eyes flashing and eager. With one bound he perched himself on the chimney-piece, and following his movement I saw that the brightness of the reflections in the mirror was growing dim and blurred. Simultaneously came the strong inward call to attend, and I felt my hair just raised by a draught of cold breeze that came from nowhere. It, whatever it was coming. At that, sheer unreasoning terror seized me. It had been bad enough the night before when Hugh was there, and when his two guests gave the comforting sense of companionship. Now, when it had caught me alone, the terror was 10 times magnified. Yet, in spite of it, I did not simply, because I could not, merely leave the room. The flesh and blood of me cried out to go. But some force, as overmastering as brute physical compulsion, made me get up and walk across the room to where the mirror hung, already a black oblong on the wall. It was dark in the mirror, but very soon I saw that it was dark because I was actually standing in the dim room which it disclosed. A little light came filtering through the blind of the window opposite me, and in the dimness I began to see the objects that the room contained. Everything appeared life-sized, as if I was actually standing there. Opposite then was the window through which this little light came. On the left of it was a dressing table, where silver faintly gleamed, and also I could just see a glass and a decanter. To the left of that was another window over which curtains were drawn. On the left-hand wall a bed projected into the room, and on the pillow was a woman's head. I appeared to stand close to the foot of this bed. On the right-hand wall beside the window was a closed door, and near it a fireplace. Over the fireplace hung a mirror, and I saw that in form and curve and size it was the mirror into which I was now looking. Suddenly this door opened, and a man carrying a lantern came in. He flashed it quickly round the room, and then came across towards the bed where the woman lay. She sprang up to a sitting position, and the light fell on her face, so that for 1 second I saw it quite clearly. Next moment he had seized her pillow and bent it round her head, appearing to tie it there, and wildly groping, she wrestled with him. He made one dreadful slicing movement with his hand across her throat, and I saw the blood stream on her nightdress. She clutched him, and across the room they struggled together, while the blood flowed from her. Then, as the life ebbed, her struggle ceased, and presently she sank in a heap on the floor. But I had seen her face before it was smothered in the pillow, and I knew I had seen it or its presentment before. Gradually the light came back into the mirror, and I found myself looking no longer at these horrors, but at my own white reflection. there was a soft thud on the ground beside me, and Cyrus had jumped down again. At that moment, I heard a motor stop at the street door and went downstairs. Hugh had just let himself in, and behind him, carrying a rug, stood his chauffeur, and instantly I knew who was the man who had come into a bedroom one night and done to death the woman who slept there. A hunt through picture papers next day confirmed the identity of the woman, and after making certain arrangements, Hugh rang his bell that night a little before 12, which was the summons for his chauffeur. He talked to him for some minutes while I watched the mirror, and when again it began to grow dark, I nodded to Hugh, who got up from his chair. "Look in that mirror, Atkinson," he said, and as he spoke the curtain behind me twitched. For myself, I merely watched Atkinson's face, and presently there passed over it a change so appalling that the mask of horror I looked on seemed scarcely human. A hideous pallor spread over the man's face. The sweat poured from him. His mouth opened and panted for breath, and his eyes, glued to the glass that showed him his own crime, seemed to bulge and protrude from his head. Then, with a yell that still sounds in my ears, he fell in a heap on the hearthrug, and from behind the curtain there stepped out the two men whom Scotland Yard had sent down. There remains but little to be told. In the wretched man's bedroom, hidden beneath a chest of drawers, were found certain banknotes of which the numbers were known. Subsequently, I went to Wimbledon, and there in the bedroom where Mrs. Yates's body was discovered in the morning by her maid was an oblong of unfaded paper above the chimney-piece, commensurate with the shape of the Chippendale Mirror. You might be one of those people like me who doesn't like the stories to be interrupted with ads. And this podcast has ads on it. However, there is a solution. If you would like access to the stories without ads and a link to a library of all the stories I've ever done that you can download without ads, you can get that by becoming a patron. So if you join for $5 or the equivalent in your currency a month, you can have all the stories ad-free. So consider becoming a patron. Go to patreon.com/barcud, BARCUD. So that was the Chippendale Mirror by E.F. Benson, and it was published in 1912 in his collection Visible and Invisible. It was reprinted. I don't think I have a copy of Visible and Invisible, but it was reprinted into the London Fog Eerie Tales from the Weird City in 2021 by the British Library. And if you haven't got any of their Library of the Weird, they do detectives as well, but I've mainly got the weird ones, and they surface all sorts of stories that would otherwise have been lost. And I think certainly if you live in the UK, I used to have a subscription to them, and every month I would get a new one. But I found I couldn't read them fast enough. So even though they were great, I stopped my subscription. Anyway, so we've done a bunch of E.F. Benson stories before, so I'll quickly go over his bio. So Edward Frederick Benson, known as Fred, born 1867 at Wellington College in Berkshire, very prestigious public school, and he was the fifth child of Edward White Benson, a notable figure who was headmaster there at Wellington at the time. Later was Bishop of Cornwall at Truro, and Archbishop of Canterbury, the top dog in the Anglican Church. When he was at Cambridge, the dad this is, was a founder member of the Ghost Club, so he had an interest in supernatural stuff. As he had 5 kids, and probably didn't call them kids, and his wife Mary Sidgwick. So his family were very literary, and his brother Arthur Christopher A.C., Robert Hugh. We've done Basil Netherby by A.C., Robert Hugh, who became a Catholic and ended up as a prebendary, I don't think that's the right word, to the Pope in Rome. His sister Maggie Margaret was an Egyptologist, and she had mental health problems in the 40s, and she was in fact probably the most brilliant of them all. They all were very significant. So Land and Hope and Glory, Land of Hope and Glory, the kind of English national anthem, if you like, rather than the British national anthem, was written. The words to it were written by Robert Hugh AC. Oh, God, I've just had you get these mental. There we are. So anyway, let's go to Fred. Let's quickly gloss over my little potential problem there, and this is what I do throughout my life. So he was a public school educated, Temple Grove School, Marlborough College. His first book was about sketches from Marlborough, but his first novel, Dodo, in 1893, achieved immediate fame when he was still a very young man. And this was a kind of a satirical look at the bright young things, the upper class bohemian types or society types. And Fred, if you read his books, he did work for a living. He was a writer, but he spent a lot of time with the leisured rich who just seemed to go on country house weekends and be silly, really. He wrote some fantastic ghost stories. I think he was a great man. He was a figure skater as well. In the winter, he represented England in figure skating, and I think he's a great writer. Is he the best? Now people say M.R. James. Now M.R. James can be very frightening because of the weird elements. I've talked about that with M.R. James before. He's a definite weird fiction guy, much as he might not have liked Lovecraft's overblown prose style. Lovecraft liked him, though, as we know. We've talked about that before. M.R. James. I think E.F. Benson at his best is as good as M.R. James. Don't shoot me. I just said it. Comments. Anyway, so Benson during his lifetime was most famous for his comic novels, Dodo the Second, Lucia and Map. But he also he lived in Rye, Sussex, for much of his life, a very pretty little town, and he died in 1940 of throat cancer, and he's buried in Rye. He was gay, and he spent his summers in Capri with Somerset Maugham, another writer, and winters figure skating. And he must have found some time to write. So when he lived in Rye, he was mayor of Rye, in fact, as well, I see, and contributed to the church and memorial window in memory of his brother in the church. And he had an open house. Henry James stayed there, the great American writer. So, and so as I said, he was gay, and that doesn't come across at all, except in his non-supernatural stuff. It doesn't come across. I didn't finish my sentence. It doesn't come across markedly in his supernatural fiction, but it does in his other, some of his other work, particularly a novel he wrote called David Blaze. His relationship with Hugh Granger in the story. Hugh Granger appears in a couple of the stories, and he certainly is in the house with the brick kiln, and they go trout fishing. And does it in the one with the Picts, the lights? Is he in that one? He might be in that one, and he's in the room in the tower as well. So I was very interested in Hugh Granger. I don't know why. Anyway, when I started writing the notes about this, a couple of things, kind of really big themes, came up, and I ended up going down a rabbit hole. It's New Year's Eve. There's a storm blasting outside, lots of wind and rain. I've been out with the dogs. Ruby hated every second of it, running from bush to tree, hiding behind banks, looking miserable the whole time as this icy wind, icy rain, like really stinging, icy cold rain. I was absolutely so wet, I could wring my gloves out, and my boots, my welly boots, they didn't leak, but my trousers were so wet, it was just, and Ruby didn't like it. Jasper is more sang-froid about the whole thing. He's like, well, here we are, it's raining, so what? I really enjoyed it. It was fantastic. I thought, the trees will come down. Some trees will come down with the wind, but it was awesome in the real sense of the word. Now, we haven't got Callie at the moment because she's in season. She's coming out of season, so she can come back home soon. I've missed her over Christmas. I've had a really nice Christmas, so that's been good. Anyway, what were we talking about? I sat down. So I was explaining the rain. You know, some people, when they do these stories, they put rain noises in. I've done it even, or you put artificial rain noises in, and people always complain about them. It doesn't sound like real rain. I can't hear the story. They would say, yeah, okay, mate. I'd say to them, I've got the story without rain. Just don't be such a lazy dolt and look for it. They're all without the rain. The rain is for the people who want the rain. There is also a version for you who don't want the rain. Simple search. Look for it. Anyway, but they don't. I mean, yeah, probably a lot of people do, and I only get the ones who are too lazy to search, and it's much easier to type some kind of response. What kind of man am I? I'm a misanthropist, potentially, these days, as I'm getting older and crabbier. Anyway, the themes that I thought were really interesting, there were two, really, and they both involved a huge rabbit hole, and then I had to rein myself back in. Because number one is, how does this compare to a detective story of the same period, so the golden age of detective fiction? How does this, because in essence it presents as a detective story, doesn't it? So I thought, oh, that's really interesting, the structure, because of course I do the detective channel. I've just done a Sherlock Holmes story yesterday, the Boscombe Valley mystery, which was really good. So, and I was thinking about how the Holmes story, but it's also true for all the Golden Age stuff. So first of all, in a detective story, you are presented with the facts of the murder or whatever, of the crime. Yeah, usually, boom, and they're presented very often as a fait accompli, and then the role of the sleuth is to turn that around and upturn it and make what was so obvious to close-minded people completely the opposite through his or her brilliance. Yeah, okay. So, but this starts off with the facts of the story. So we get that. The facts of the murder. The first section is Mrs. Yates' murder. And there are red herrings given there, aren't there? So the two very things that they often do are, you know, the husband has an alibi, but does he? Because we immediately think, oh, it's bound to be him, because it's already been set up for that. They're on bad terms, and he's just given her a lot of money. So, yeah, he's number one suspect. So that is exactly what would happen in the detective story. And then, of course, there is two things are said. There are three things said, really, which become apparent later. Again, like a detective story. So first of all, the servants always get a grilling, don't they? Because they're poor people and they have to work for a living. So, and they never see this kind of money that their idle, rich masters and mistresses flout. So, you know, they're bound to be tempted. So they get grilled. Now, he says, none of them appear to have come into sudden affluence. Good. Does that settle it? Well, later on we find out the murderer, the chauffeur, had the self-possession not to spend his cash. And so that explains that little problem. And then there's the other thing about how, and this is more subtle, the husband is driven up to London by the chauffeur. He stays overnight, and we're told that the chauffeur brings the car back because she's going to use it to get to the station the next day, and he's going to meet her at Victoria Station. Yeah, that is the setup. Now, what I didn't understand is why the chauffeur would come in by the window. But anyway, but I think so far so good. That is a detective story setup. And then the next part of the detective story is whereby we have the sleuth, be it Poirot, Miss Marple, you know, Lord Peter Wimsey, or anybody. Sherlock Holmes, of course, they then go detecting. And usually in the classic in the golden age of detection, what we see is it's impenetrable to us mere mortals. So we're looking on and we see the detective doing all sorts of weird, clever stuff, and we don't really understand why. And that is the next part. The parallel in this is them seeing into the mirror. So it's like a supernatural detection, a psychic detection, although it's not active. Well, is it active on? It is partly active on their part because they seek it out, don't they? So that is so far is parallel with Sherlock Holmes with his science. Instead of science, we have mysticism. Of course, remember, this is a guy who came from a deeply religious family, a deeply spiritual family, and from what he says in his stories, I think he probably also believed. I've never read a biography of him, perhaps should, in the spiritual world. That is the equivalent, therefore. Now, very interesting thing, they look into the mirror three main times. There is a fourth time when they don't look into it. It's the denouement. The criminal looks into it and has apoplexy. And one thing I didn't think was very realistic is that if because detective stories very often they go to some pains to make them realistic, in that the crime is one that's prosecutable, in that the police would act. Whereas I think if you'd gone to the cops and said, "Listen, Scotland Yard, not your ordinary local police station, but Scotland Yard, you send two blokes around, we presume they're blokes, to stand behind a curtain. I'll get the chauffeur in at midnight, so you're going to be on overtime, and he's going to fall down. You then have everything you need to arrest him." I think they'd go, "I don't think so." For all sorts of reasons, I don't think we're going to do that. So I think that is perhaps a little, but one wonders how much contact Fred had with the workings of the actual police force. Whereas I think in many cases, certainly with Dickens used to go out with them. But I think in many cases, and certainly I interviewed Peter James a couple of months ago, big crime writer, and he was saying that he actually goes out with the Brighton cops on the beat, and when they've got new techniques, they talk to him about it. So I think crime writers, modern crime writers, and even proper crime writers, and I'm saying Benson wasn't one, they spent time with the cops. I'm not sure that Benson did. I may be proved wrong. As I said, I haven't read his biography, but it strikes me if he thinks the cops would turn up for that, maybe not. And then the final thing is the denouement, whereby the story is explained, and we do get that because they have the final vision, the third vision. Oh yeah, things come in threes in folklore and ghost stories, and they look once, twice, three times, and the third time is the solution. They go and he recognises the chauffeur, which is a massive coincidence, really, isn't it? That Hugh Granger would have engaged the very same man, because the chauffeur and the mirror don't come together. He finds the mirror in Putney. It's got nothing to do with the chauffeur, that he's also but I suppose if you're a believer in the supernatural, you might suggest that the workings of the supernatural brought the two things together. So that's a bit of a get out of jail card. But anyway, so after the third time, they go in the picture post and they see the faces of the murdered woman, and they know the chauffeur, Bob's your uncle, and that is in a sense an equivalent. So in a funny way, it is a parallel to the structure of a detective novel, but it's deduction through the spiritual. So that was my first. And there's a whole bunch of, Algernon Blackwood, etc. I was just looking into him. John Silence. There's a whole, Karnacki, the Ghost Finder. There are a whole bunch of supernatural detectives. I've even got one in my City of Light, Unreal City, etc., trilogy, if you'd care to look that up. Anyway, the next, so that's an essay in itself, isn't it? That is a PhD in itself. That the parallels between supernatural fiction and Golden Age fiction, and where they both come from Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, of course, who wrote both detective stories and supernatural stories. The other thing I wanted to say, the other mouse hole, I went down, was the role of cats in supernatural fiction, and it strikes me there's a poet called Christopher Smart in the 18th century. He wrote a poem called Jubilate Agno, and it's "For I will consider my cat Geoffrey." And he talks about, "For when his day's work is done, his business more properly begins. For he keeps the Lord's watch in the night against the adversary. For he counteracts the powers of darkness by his electrical skin and glaring eyes." So the cat has always been very often associated with the supernatural. Cats have different roles to dogs, for example, in ghost stories. I've read a lot of ghost stories now. The role of a dog is usually, sadly, to die. The role of a cat is quite different. Not all. We had a story recently where the dog didn't die, and I'm like, hooray! But mostly the poor dog, if a dog appears in a ghost or horror story, its days are numbered. Cat's not. So in this story, Cat is like Geoffrey, Christopher Smart's cat, the first line of detection against otherworldly forces. Their keen senses are tuned to the slightest disturbances in the veil between worlds. I think this is due to the habit of, if you've ever had a cat, and you'll be sitting there and the cat will suddenly get up and look at the corner of the room, and you're like, what are you looking at? And the cat appears to see something. And I think maybe it does see ghosts, or maybe there's a mundane explanation, but I think that's why cats are given this role as seers and sensors of the supernatural. And it struck me in the stories I've read out on the podcast that cats do this, and we have Cyrus. Cyrus is not a very endearing cat. I like a lovely, warm, affectionate farmyard tom. Well, not necessarily farmyard, but of that stock. A big lazy tomcat. Could be ginger, could be tabby, could be black, could be white, although they suffer from deafness, as my mother used to tell me. White cats are always deaf. Now, this isn't true because I've maybe said this before. I used to, whenever I saw a white cat, I would try and creep up on it or make a noise behind its back to see if it turned round. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. I don't think that was a massively scientific experiment, but apparently, like I met a guy with a big white dog the other day, and he said that's deaf. So I think potentially, albino cats and dogs can be deaf, but maybe that just attunes their senses. So then I was thinking of, I did Gerald Durrell's The Entrance, which is set in a French chateau, and the cat becomes increasingly agitated and fearful as it senses the unseen menace. This is a bit like. So in that case, of course, the cat is frightened. Cyrus loves it. And in fact, he has Hugh Granger, Fred Benson has Hugh Granger say that cats love the dead. I thought that was a fantastically interesting thing to say. Another rabbit hole there. So, they're definitely a bridge between the mundane and the supernatural. Of course, there's another cat that strikes in E.F. Benson's The Room in the Tower, where Hugh Granger also is, this cat that's related to Mrs. Stone, and it appears in the recurring dream and the real life medication. It's very agitated. Again, it appears to be the dog is frightened of the thing in the room in the tower, and the cat really likes it. So I think Fred Benson had this idea that cats were in league with the devil, or league with the powers of darkness, And then, of course, we have, the black cat. I've done that. Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat, yeah, and he kills his pet Pluto. This is a grim story, a grim story. And then we have Lovecraft's The Cats of Ulthar. We have Stephen King's Pet Sematary, the family cat Church. So cats can be sensors of the supernatural, harbingers of doom. That is to say, things happen that show the cat is involved in the doom is coming sort of idea, rather than just sensing it is in some sense an omen itself, a living omen. I haven't explained that very well, but it's like a banshee's wail, isn't it? Yeah, rather than, it's not just a sense, it's a warning in a sense, or it's actively involved with darkness. And I think this is associated with, in some of these stories, as we said, the cats can be evil as well, and then we have them as active supernatural agents, and I think that is sort of Pluto really in The Black Cat, the Church in Pet Sematary. And there's an Algernon Blackwood story called Ancient Sorceries, which is a more complex role for the cats. It's in a French town where the inhabitants transform into cats at night. Of course, it was Catwoman. It was Natasha Kinski. Well, I was a young teenager at that time, and it certainly had a profound effect on me. And in fact, Michelle Pfeiffer as Catwoman, I think that's got nothing to do with the supernatural. I think that's got to do with other things. And that is another rabbit hole for me to go down. But, I thought the two themes there that I picked up. One is the parallel between how do they relate to each other? They come from a common origin, but how does the detective story and the ghost story, because I'm doing both at the moment, as you know, how do they relate? So that was interesting to me. And then this cat. So I think if you do want to do your PhD on this, I think the role of cats in supernatural fiction, and potentially a little subsection on comparing the role of cats with the roles of dogs in supernatural fiction, because there will be other cases that dogs have a more active. I mean, there's the Hound of the Baskervilles as well. Oh, their mine's just tripped off. I think it's time for me to stop. The storm is blowing. There are things to do. I've got to produce this. I've got to do the thumbnail. I've got to do the blurb. I've got to do all sorts of stuff. So my work is not finished, but my blabbering is.